Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album You by the band Gong.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So yeah, today we are reviewing You. No, not You. You. No, yeah, you, not you. Yeah, that you. Yeah, you. Anyway, enjoy some of my favorite bits from this album. So today's band of topic is one that I could genuinely elaborate so much about. I can go into infinity talking about these guys and all of their, family tree of Gong. There's so many different things that I can say, and I think that will prove a bit difficult because I basically want to keep this review as short, concise, and simple as I can, seeing as this is the first and last time we are encountering Gong this year. I know, it is absurd, but that's just the case. And of course, the album we got to review today is You, otherwise known as Radio No Invisible Part 3. And the story of Gong starts us off with a man called David Allen, who was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1938, and he's basically grown up to become this composer, poet, and very talented guitarist, and in the years he has perfected his craft, and even in around about like the 50s joined the beat movement. And in the year of 1961, Allen migrated to the UK in search of taking his music profession to the professional level, and there he would form that same year his first band, at least in the UK, called the David Allen Trio, which was basically a free-form jazz trio consisting of himself, Hugh Hopper, and the son of his landlord, who was only 16 at the time, which you might know as Robert Wyatt. And the David Allen Trio would go on in conjecture with yet another band called the Wildflowers to basically metastasize into a band in 1966 called the Soft Machine. And after a successful tour with the Soft Machine in 1967, Allen was actually not permitted to re-enter the UK, seeing as his visa expired, so he was left stranded with his girlfriend at the time, Gilly Smith, in France. But to make a bad matter better, David had actually decided to make the best out of the situation, and in France he would form not one but two new musical groups, the first one being Banana Moon Band and the second one of course being Gong. Now these two bands would actually disband the same year because of the Paris protests of 1968, which Allen actually took part in, but after receiving an offer for a recording contract with the French label, Gong would reassemble in 1969. Now in that same year, Gong would release their debut studio album called Magic Brother, but in that time David Allen was also considering just pursuing his own solo musical career, so he allocated a lot of time for it and produced his own first solo album called Banana Moon, which was released in 1971, but after that point in time he would devote almost all of his efforts to creating music with Gong. And in the spring of 1971, the lineup of the band consisted of 5 members, of course being David Allen, Gilly Smith, as well as Didier Malherbe, Christian Trish, and P. Pyle, and together they would create what they would consider to be, at least in hindsight, the first real Gong album called Camembert Electrique. And after releasing a movie soundtrack that same year, the band would go on to reform and change its lineup in several drastic ways, becoming a pretty big group, sometimes even consisting of 10 members. But just to give context to some things over here, it's not like they were just this big, very big band, but instead they lived sort of like in a commune. They migrated to an abandoned 12-room hunting lodge in southern France and just kind of lived there and started working on their music with people coming and going basically all the time. And at that time they started working on what would later be known as the Radio No Invisible trilogy. Now, just to point this out, one of the more influential people that joined Gong at the time was of course no other than UK guitarist Steve Hillage, and well, his opportunism for the band was definitely big, because from this point onwards David Eden was not the only guitarist in the band, thus splitting their responsibilities and of course interjecting the brilliance of how Hillage plays. And finally, in the spring of 1973, the band would go on to release their third studio album, being the first one in the Radio No Invisible trilogy, called Flying Teapot, and this one would surprisingly be released at the same day of yet another seminal album, being Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. Now, Flying Teapot would actually be followed up that same year in December with the second entry into the series, being Angel's Egg, and then also followed up with the third installment of the series in October of 1974 called You. Now, this is the point of the video where I'll be cutting the review, at least reviewing the backstory of Gong in this album, due to this one already getting quite long and I haven't even started talking about this album. And you know, it surprises me honestly. A lot of the people who gave me the recommendations for this series were friends of mine that I know for a fact love this band to bits, yet somehow I guess everyone just took it for granted that I either knew Gong or that someone else would recommend them. So as it happened, I only got one recommendation of Gong this year, but surely I'll come back to these guys next year and dive into the Gong mythology. But for now, let's dive right into You. Yes, you. No, not you. You. Oh, I actually already did that joke. Now, I must admit, it is a bit of a shame that I'm getting to know this trilogy from its end. I don't believe that there's a lot of continuation that I'm just missing out on here, but again, I just would have loved to see the progression chronologically with these three albums, but as it stands, I guess I'm fine with it. And when it comes down to this album and basically all of Gong, at least at the start of their way, these guys are considered to be a part of the Canterbury scene. And while I do definitely understand why that is, and they do share a lot of players and similarities to a lot of the Canterbury scene, I would actually classify this more as psych rock. Now, when I review music, I generally try to rate each and every song that I'm listening to and do so individually. And sometimes we just get these very stranded songs that don't really have a lot of effect. They either be short or they're just out of context in many ways, so I give them a rating of X out of 10, which basically means not rated, but I sort of got the point. And well, that might happen maybe once per album, but usually it doesn't happen. But the thing is, with this album, it happened to me 3 times consecutively with the first 3 tracks on this album. So this album opens up with Thoughts for Naught, a PHP Advice, and Magic Mother Invocation. All of these 3 tracks come up to about 6 minutes of runtime, and honestly, they're very uneventful despite some things going on in them. They're very varied in many senses, but I just don't feel like they stand on their own in any way, and I do view them as some sort of a very unique build-up coming up to the 4th track on the album, being Master Builder. Now, Master Builder is the payoff, the first payoff at least in this entire album. You've been waiting for 6 minutes and now you get it. And of course the payoff here is the drums come clashing down with very bassy drums, and of course we get a saxophone solo, which would become a recurring motif on this album. And actually this one, when compared to something else to give you a perspective, I would say that it sounds a lot like Lord of Light by Hawkwind. Though my personal favorite track from the album is the one to come right after it, and it's called A Sprinkling of Clouds. This one is amazing. I'm actually surprised to see that so many people like this one because it didn't seem like an obvious choice for me, at least not at first. This one is soothing, it's psychedelic, it's definitely a trip, but it's one that I was very happy to devote to and just go on. This song does everything right. It has a very unique and very stretched out build up, but the way there is just so much worth it. Of course, you have no vocals, only instrumentals, you have these very Indian percussion sounds, and of course at the end you even get an interchanging flute and saxophone solo, so honestly, what more could I ask for? And how does the band follow up this masterful track? Well, with something completely different. The next track is called Perfect Mystery, and well, it doesn't sound anything like anything this album has presented so far. I would describe it somewhat as a very unique duet, but a disturbing one as well. There's two people, they're duetting, there's the girl, there's the boy. I don't really know what's going on with this one. They have an obsession with eyes and eyes coming out. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but I guess that it's a good track after all. Now the next track on the album is called The Isle of Everywhere, which this one is definitely the more freeform jazzy song. It does linger somewhat with the Gilly Smith vocals from the last track, which I personally enjoyed, and it also features the first real Steve Hillage guitar solo on the album, which again, very much enjoyable. If you like Fish Rising, you're gonna like this one probably too. And the thing is that I was thinking about when I thought of this one is that there's always a very interesting interplay of instruments on this entire album. It doesn't ever seem like there's this one instrument that leads the album off, but then I gave this yet another listen and I was like, you know what? Yes, there is just one, and it's Mike Howlett playing the bass so masterfully. He's omnipresent on this album, and honestly, everything just sticks together because he does his job so freaking well. Now, the last track on the album, which is called You Never Blow Your Trip Forever, now I'm saying your, but it's actually just a Y and an R. Guess that's logical. Is an unfortunate conclusion to this album, to say the least. This one is about 11.5 minutes long and they're very forgetful. Honestly needless, I don't feel like they have the same effect as a track like A Sprinkling of Clouds, despite trying to achieve the same effect. It just sounds to me like a bunch of psychedelic chit chatter and not really hitting any major memorable points, and to me it just seems like a very big miss because this album could have concluded in such a fine way, but unfortunately, seeing as this is such a long track and is integral to its overall structure, I'd have to include it in my overall assessment of this one. But yeah, all in all, this is a pretty cool album. I enjoyed a lot of it, despite it not really being my cup of prog per se. I think that I'll get a better understanding of what I think of this band when I get to listen to more of their albums. Of course, Camembert Electrique, The Flying Teapot, Angel's Eggs, they're all gonna be reviewed next year, hopefully sooner than later. But for now, that's what I had to say about this album, and let's move on to talking about its cover. So honestly, I quite like this album cover, and to me it feels sort of like the very long lost brother of The Dark Side of the Moon. And I love looking at this one and looking and seeing the progression that the album covers have gone through up until this point, at least in the Radio No Invisible trilogy. So of course you have the first one with the flying teapot. It just looks like something that a child drew without really thinking too much about it. And then you have somewhat of a continuation of this in Angel's Egg with the drawing, but of course you have the new Gong logo, which is definitely perfected in today's album cover of You. And honestly, there's really not a lot that I can say as to why I love this one, other than the fact that yes, the cover does seem to represent the music really, really well. I've been listening to this music all along and I've been thinking to myself, you know what, it genuinely looks like this star circling this pyramid in space, and it has these burning colors to it. I don't know how you achieve this, but apparently this is what it feels like. So honestly, this album deserves a rating of 8, but with a heavy heart, seeing as it was spoiled at the end, I'll have to lower it down a bit and give it a rating of 7 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to A l'Amitié by the band Aqua Surge. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Arista Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.